das richtige Mikrofon nehmen. Welches ist jetzt links? Das da. Genau, so. Also, Corona ist ein bisschen kompliziert, aber wir haben es gleich. Also, liebes Publikum, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, ich begrüße Sie ganz herzlich hier im E-Werk in der Galerie für Gegenwartskunst zum Vortrag von Professor Dr. Markus Wild zum Thema Mensch-Tier-Gemeinschaften in der Stadt. Mein Name ist Heidi Brunschweiler, ich bin die Leiterin der Gegenwartskunst im E-Werk. Now I want to welcome Patrick Goddard. You can't see him now, but he is the artist in which, or the context of his show is the occasion to invite Professor Wild to talk about the human-animal relation. Patrick will only hear us. He will later, when we join the discussion with him, appear on the screen. And that's also one reason why I switched to English, because otherwise Patrick couldn't follow us. And we have also many friends from Hong Kong and all over the world, so that's why we speak tonight English. So to all of you all over, also in the live stream, a very warm welcome. So as I said, this lecture takes place in the context of Patrick's exhibition, Die Biester, and Patrick is a British artist who has been an observer of the urban space for many years. And he deals with the Anthropocene through urban ecologies. And Anthropocene is the term that come up quite a lot, but it means actually the change of the planet through human activities. He explores the ever-expanding urbanization in the post-industrial late capitalist world, using the human-animal relationship and the end of the wilderness. He asks what means to live in an increasingly artificial environment. And his approach is, those who have seen the show, he uses black humor and an aesthetic of irreverence, and to talk about speculatively about future forms of existence. And just briefly introduction to the lecture, because this urban space is so important in Patrick's work, we invited Professor Dr. Martin Wild from Basel to give us this talk. And he will explore this human-animal relation within these urban environments in depth in his talk. So just brief introduction. He studied, Professor Dr. Wild studied philosophy and German language and literature at University of Basel, where he also did his doctorate on a topic which might come up tonight as well. So he explored the anthropological difference in the philosophy of the mind in the early modern period. So basically the categorical difference between human and animals in philosophy. Then he moved on to Berlin, to the Humboldt University, where he was an assistant at the chair of theoretical philosophy, and I guess you completed there your habilitation, and you came then back to Fribourg, Switzerland, not to Freiburg, but to Fribourg, and after a short stay there, he was appointed in 2014 as a professor of philosophy, and as you know, he has published widely, so one of his focus point in his research is animal philosophy, which he published introduction in 2008 in this in the Junius Verlag, and I really recommend it. It's really a history about philosophy and thinking the human and the animal relation through time and history. Then he published another nice introduction to animal ethics in 2016, together with Harvik Grimm, also in Junius, and he, you can hear also a lot of of his talks on podcasts and in the media. I just want to mention before I stop that he also is a member in the research committee of the Swiss National Fund and also in the executive board of ICONES, which we might come up later when we discuss his interest in interdisciplinary topics. So without further ado, a very warm welcome, and we are looking forward to your talk.
Okay, thank you very much for the warm welcome and the introduction. And hello to Patrick on the acoustic side of this conference. Looking very much forward to our discussion. And thank you for joining us here in this room or in the live stream for this debate. Let me just start by saying it's only recently that I became interested in the urban animal. And this is due to a cooperation with two young researchers from the University of Zurich, Madeleine Geiger and Evelyn Hüppi. They both are biologists, and they look into morphological changes of animals that live in the city. So how the life in the city really transforms the way animals are. And because of this cooperation, I became interested in the question of the urban animal, or animals living in urban environments and in urban landscapes. As you might expect from a philosopher, I'm not going into specific materialities. I rather take a bird's eye point of view and want to exchange with you some ideas about urban animals from a very general perspective and a very general point of view. Okay, let's get started. Maybe when you think about urban animals, the first things that comes to mind are images like the one you can see now on the PowerPoint. On the one hand, you see pigeons in a city on a Mediterranean island. The pigeons are urban animals for a long time, and it's not clear whether they are wild animals or domesticated animals. There is a certain issue going on here. Or you might think of dogs like these you see on the other picture. These are dogs living in the city center of Sarajevo. This picture is actually from an activist, Jelena Punovic, who was documenting dogs' behavior in order to counteract the idea that city dogs in Sarajevo are especially aggressive. They are not. In every sense. There are aggressive encounters, but as you can see from the pictures you've taken, the dogs live as stray dogs with the human inhabitants of the city, and there is a kind of togetherness that they share in Sarajevo. I visited the dogs in Sarajevo, and my impression was quite that they really have adapted to all kinds of encounters with human beings. But these actually are not the animals I want to talk about. It's not about stray dogs or pigeons, animals we really know being urban animals. The animals I want to focus are these animals. The one is a human being, here represented by a woman in the megacity of Cairo. And the other one is a red fox, here from a very nice picture taken by Matthew Murren in London, where the fox encounters per chance a fox graffiti. So what I'm interested in are urban animals in two senses: human beings as urban animals and wild animals entering urban landscapes. Before I start, let's take a look at a certain institution that has already brought animals, wild, exotic animals, into urban environments and urban landscapes. And this, of course, is the zoo. You can see here a map of the city of Basel, where I come from, and in the red circle is the marking point for the Basel Zoo, or as the people in Basel call it, the Zolli. And the Basel Zoo, of course, is a part in the city where wild and exotic animals live. As you can see on this plan of Basel Zoo, the map, there are lions, elephants, giraffes, bears, wolves, and of course other species, birds, insects, and many more. So what we have for a long time in many cities in Europe, in the northern parts of the world, that we enclose actually wild and exotic animals within the city in close encounters. And in a way, That's quite bizarre. So why do we want exotic and wild animals in urban landscapes? Here you can see a picture from Basel from the 1952, where the elephants from the Basel Zoo walk through the inner city, and people watch this kind of elephant parade. Later on, they stopped it, but in the beginning, after the Second World War, there were a lot of parades with elephants and later with penguins. So why do we want this kind of exotic animals in urban landscapes? Of course, we should not forget, this just as a hint, that we had also so-called wild and exotic human beings, the so-called primitive human beings, in urban landscapes as part of zoological zoo exhibitions. These were the famous Völkerschauen in the late 19th century until the 30s and 40s of the 20th century. And what you can see here is an advertisement of such an exhibition of people in the zoological garden in Basel. This picture is actually taken from the website of the Zoo of Basel, so Basel Zoo tries to represent the whole history and also these kind of dark parts of exhibitions of human beings in the zoo surroundings. But let's go back to animals, wild and exotic animals in city surroundings. So why exotic animals in urban landscapes? One very decisive answer and one very influential answer was given by Heini Hediger, a Swiss biologist and director of Basel Zoo and director of the Zurich Zoo. You can see him here, maybe talking with a llama in Zurich Zoo. And Hediger defined 4 basic reasons for having animals in zoos in urban landscapes. The first reason was recreation. I will come back to that reason because these first reasons interest me the most. The second one is education. He thought the zoo is an educational institution where we learn about animals. The third one is research. We should be able to do research on animals, and the zoo will provide opportunity. And of course, fourth, conservation, that we will be able to conserve endangered species and provide a kind of arche-Noah for endangered species within the zoo. And certainly today, the fourth reason become more and more important given the loss of biodiversity all over the world. But I want to focus on the first reason now, the reason recreation. And the thinking or the idea behind this reason can be explained as follows. The zoo in a city is a recreational area for the urban population and thus constitutes an emergency exit to nature. So the basic idea is human beings living in an urban environment are in a way alienated from nature. They are separated from nature. That's why we have to bring nature into the city in order to get the citizens that live in the city in touch, in close contact with real wild and exotic nature. You can spell out this reasoning behind this idea of recreation in several points, and I go shortly through these 5 points. So the basic idea is modern human beings live in an artificial environment, the city, and the artificial environment, the city, is thought to be a non-natural habit for human beings. Only if you think that cities are non-natural for human beings, you feel that they should somehow get in touch with real nature, nature as the habitat of wild animals, and their own nature as originally not belonging in the city. This seems to be the reasoning behind this recreational aspect. Second point, obviously, because modern humans live in the city, they have lost contact with nature and also with their own nature. They are absorbed in business, in daily work routines. So what they have lost is a touch with sensuality, with a life that is not structured by modern capitalism or modern society. And that's why, this seems to be the reasoning, human beings have lost contact with nature, the realm of animals, and their own nature in the city. Therefore, the third point, modern human beings need an emergency exit to nature in the city. This is kind of a curing or a repository of a natural reminder within the city. And wild and exotic animals, of course, provide contact with nature and an emergency to nature. It's important that they are present as live beings, because only with the real beings in front of you, you can have a kind of sensual or corporal contact with those animals, seeing them, smelling them, hearing them. And finally, that's why wild and exotic animals should be kept in artificial, non-natural environment, the zoo in the city. As you can see, this reasoning is somehow paradoxical. In order to cure the modern human being that lives in an artificial environment, we create artificial environments for wild animals in order to get in touch with our own nature. And when we create these artificial environments, the zoo, we of course separate the human beings living in the city and the wild animals being enclosed in the zoo within the city. The figure behind that is a kind of exclusion and inclusion at the same time, and a kind of chiasm of nature and getting in touch with nature. So what about this idea of the alienation of modern human beings living in the city? Why should we, first of all, think that cities are not a natural environment for human beings? Where is this idea coming from? Who started this idea? Well, one could think that maybe this is a Marxist idea. You know, living in the city is a kind of social alienation or social estrangement. But that's not the case. According to a Marxist perspective, the nature of man is work. Human beings are basically workers, creators, and builders. And cities is, therefore, a city is not the locus of alienation for man or human beings, since it's a human creation. So living in a city is not part of an estrangement in Marxistic sense. However, cities are stratified, there are social classes and barriers, and that's a condition which estranges modern human beings from their humanity, according to Marx. But the social fact that is a problem is social stratification. That's the problem of the city, and not living in the city. However, there is another form of alienation, which I call romantic alienation. And it's sometimes associated with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which is a wrong association, but nevertheless I put his name there because he often pops up in these discourses. And what's a romantic alienation? Well, the idea is that modern human beings living in the city are wrongly separated from nature. Which means in a city you live close with each other, and this produces unnatural wishes, desires, and Bedürfnisse in another parlance, and that creates an alienation from you living in a natural surrounding, which is nature outside the city. So according to this romantic picture, the fact of the city itself, the fact that we live in cities, is the problem. But of course, this is a very paradoxical idea, because what actually is nature? Well, one answer to the question what nature is nature is where the wild animals dwell, and many wild animals live and dwell actually in urban environments. So this is a kind of simplistic idea of a separation between the city and nature that is behind this romantic idea of alienation. And one of my ideas or goals today is to destroy this simple separation between animals in the wild and cities that are separated from nature and from the wild. In order to replace human beings back in the city, let's have a look where the criticism or the bad perspective on the city comes from the point of view of philosophy. And one very important text that was very influential, apart from many other texts, was Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and the famous part on passing by. In this chapter in the Zarathustra, Zarathustra passes before the gates of a big city, of a große Stadt, as it is called. And he talks to an inhabitant of the big city who claims that life in the city is decadent, that life in the city deprives human beings of their nature, and Zarathustra is listening to the person talking about the city. And in the end, Zarathustra says the following, and I quote, "Thus spoke Zarathustra. Then did he look on the great city and sighed, and was long silent. At last he spake thus: I loathe also this great city. Here and there is nothing to better, nothing to worsen. Woe to this great city. And I would that I already saw the pillar of fire in which it will be consumed. Where one can no longer love, there should one pass by. So the idea is that the true philosopher, and the true philosopher being expresses of true human nature, said pass by the cities, because the city are doomed to destruction. The city are the breeding pots of all bad idea of modernity, in Nietzsche's perspective, socialism, democracy, feminism, equality between human beings, bad ideas from the city that alienates human beings from their true nature. But this is a very modern philosophical view on the city. If you go back to antique philosophy, basically philosophy is understood as an activity in the city. Here is the famous quote from Cicero on Socrates, where Cicero says the following: Socrates, on the other hand, was the first to call philosophy down from the heavens and set her in the cities of men and bring her also into their homes and compel her to ask questions about life and morality and things good and evil. So what Socrates did is basically not looking at the stars, not doing philosophy in the astronomical natural science sense, but going to the city and talking to men and women, and also talking about things that concern us when we live together in cities. Because for Socrates, the city is the natural living place for human beings. No idea of estrangement, no idea of alienation. And you can see this from this Socrates quote from a text where Socrates steps outside the city in a natural or rural landscapes, and he's a little bit confused about the fact that he's now out in nature. And he says, in order to explain his confusion, he says the following words: Socrates, forgive me, my dear friend, you see, I am fond of learning. Now the country places and the trees won't teach me anything, and the people in the city do. So the only place where you can really learn about important matter of good and evil and living together is the city, and the rural landscape is not teaching you anything, it's just dumb nature. Even further is Aristotle going in his Politics, where he declares the following: it's clear that the city is a natural growth, and that man is by nature a political animal, and the man that is by nature and not merely by fortune cityless is either low in the scale of humanity or above it. So what Aristotle claims here is that the city is a completely natural creation of man, and that the city corresponds to the political nature of man. So the natural living place for human beings is actually the city. And if some human being would live outside the city, it's either close to an animal, so low in the scale of humanity, or above the scale of humanity, it's close to a god. So it's a hermit or a savage, as Aristotle sees it. So the important point is, according to the Greek philosophy, the natural living place for human beings is the city. But the second point is, if you live outside the city, you're closer to animals, which mean the city is not a natural place for wild and exotic animals. So again, you find the same separation that defines the relation between human beings and animals in the case of the zoo. There is a strict separation between human beings living in the city as a natural or non-natural place, and outside the city are wild and exotic animals. When we jump now from Greek philosophers to today's world population, the fact of urbanization is very clear. Whether or not human beings live naturally in the city, as Aristotle believed and Socrates, it's a fact that more and more human beings live in urban environments, in cities, and that the percentage of the world population living in cities will grow. As you can see here, there is a projection that from 2014 on, more than 50% of the human world population actually lives in cities. And the projection is that by 2050, it will be almost 9.725 billion of the world population living in cities, so 70%. And as you can see, the percentage is represented on the other chart. In 1980s, it was 39%. In 1915, over 50%. And the projection to 2050 is that 66%, or two-thirds of the world population, will live in urban environments or in cities. The share of urban population in all continents is not equal. As you can see from the chart on the left-hand side, the share of the urban population in North America, for example, is higher than the share in Southern Africa, or it's higher in Australia than it is in East Asia. But in all continents, urbanization is expanding, it's growing, and more of human beings live in urban environments. So whether or not it's part of human nature, it's just a fact about how we live now and how we will live in the future, that most persons on Earth will live in urban environments. Now, this fact of urbanization, that cities are growing fast, that more and more natural resources are used for urbanization and for city life, of course, causes problems for wildlife. So urbanization is not such something that happens to human beings. Urbanization seems to be a new selective force that is also changing animal communities. I will come to some examples later in my talk. It poses also a major threat to biodiversity, and this is for the following reasons. Urbanization leads to habitat fragmentation. So if a city is expanding, the habitat, the natural habitat of animals is fragmented, and this, of course, causes problem for animals when they try to mate, to recreate, and find food resources. Urbanization leads also, this is the second point, to habitat loss. For example, birds that feed on special natural food sources will lose habitat by urbanization and will have to move or will have to find new food sources or are threatened by extinction. Pollution is a problem, pollution by noise, by heat, by light, by chemical pollution. And also there is altered biotic interactions. There are more pathogens, new pathogens for animals living in cities. There are new predators in cities, and there are new prey. For example, poisoned rats are a problem for a lot of predators like mountain lions in North America. They start eating poisoned rats, and of course this is also a problem for their health. And there is finally kind of new interactions with people, given that people drive cars, they walk around, they produce noises, they interact with animals. So a kind of new stress is a factor that also affects animals by urbanization. So this is quite an old phenomenon in a way, but the expansion of urbanization and the introduction of wild animals living in urban spaces is in a way also a new phenomenon. And because it's new, there are huge research gaps in understanding the impact of urbanization on wildlife. And of course, it would be crucial to help animals to survive in urban environments to know more about how urbanization actually affects wild animals. And as you can see from this slide, many of these effects are aversive, they are problematic and potentially destructive. So urbanization correlates with a loss of biodiversity. So let me give you some examples. This is a very famous example of the peppered moth, the Birkenspanner, and industrial melanism. It has been observed in Great Britain that due to industrial pollution by smoke, that the peppered moth population changes from the black and white variety to the black variety. And one explanation is that the black variety, so the melanic, the melanism variety, is better camouflaged, the mimicry is better, and it saves it from predators. And the black and white variety was easily spotted by preying birds, so they picked out the peppered moths that were black and white. And therefore, the black variety just expanded within the population. That's a very early example and a famous textbook example for pollution and selective forces. Here's another one from South Africa, where in many cities you have these blue swallows. And blue swallows like to hunt in foggy circumstances. So they are quite good at spotting prey when there is a lot of fog and vapor in the air. However, in cities, sulfonate concentration in fog exists, and these sulfonate concentrations affect the ability of the feathers of the blue swallow to repel water. So the feathers of the blue swallow, given pollution in the city, are less good in repelling water, and of course this causes problems. And the third example, here is the Blaumeise, the African Blaumeise, the blue tit. There is a higher lead concentrations in some of these urban birds, but it seems that this lead concentration does not affect the next generation, so it's not clear whether the lead concentration is really harmful to the population or not. But you can see by these examples, pollution is an issue. Now, I want to focus going on urban mammals. So I used some bird examples. There are also lizards, insects, and of course there are also plant species in urban environments. I want to focus on urban mammals. And as you can see from this representation of the globe, there is a difference in the distribution of species density in different regions of the world. So the greener the map goes, the more percentage of mammal species live in urban environments. So Europe is very green, which means there is a high percentage of mammal species also living in urban environments. And the more it gets red, of course, the lesser is the amount of mammal species that live in urban environments. And certainly in Alaska, the Sahara, and in Siberia, we would not expect a lot of mammals living in cities because there are more or less no cities. So the city density is also relevant here. But as you can see, it goes up to 35% of the species in Europe live also in urban environments, if the mammal species to be more precisely. Here you can see, and I'm not going into the details, that there is a distinction between visitor and dweller. So some species really live in the cities, these are dwellers, and some species only visit the city from time to time. A good example is in the middle, the example that's almost only green. It's the boar, the Wildschwein. These are more or less visitors, sometimes intruding Berlin, then going back into the woods, but they not really dwell in the city. A good example for a dweller is the carnivore, the red fox. Red foxes live in urban environments in Europe since the 1930s, so more or less for 100 years, and they have a long history of urban adaptation. And as you can see, the species or the order that is the strongest representation is the bats and other flying mammals, where a high percentage is dwelling or visiting cities. I show you some examples of mammals living in or near cities. This is a very famous picture of a leopard in Indian Mumbai. So this is one example of a predator living in a city. I could also have shown lions, mountain lions living in California, in Californian cities. And they seem to behave quite well within the city. So there is not a lot of contact with the urban population. So somehow they get used to move in the cities. There is also footage that leopards and mountain lions are quite good of managing traffic. I once crossed a road in Berlin at night with a fox, and I had the impression that the fox knows the difference between red and green on the street light, because he really behaved as if he would observe the traffic. And there is footage that they seem to adapt to a lot of traffic here. But of course, there are a lot of other mammals living in urban environments. In the middle, you can see a badger on a cemetery in Bristol, England. Below, you can see 2 deers on a cemetery in Basel, the Hörnli-Friedhof. And next to that, you see a beaver in Munich working on the street day long. Above the beaver, you can see a coyote living in New York. Coyotes are actually very good at populating US cities. And the other picture below is boar and young boars living in Berlin. And as you can see, the people are just watching them. They are watching a mother with the young boars, and there seems to be no problem of aggressive interaction. The problem starts when you get the hunter in order to kill them, because they mostly do not manage, and then the aggression will start. But before that, there is no real issue here. And above that, you can see a stag, a deer. I think it's in a Canadian city. So, what is missing in this negative picture, the negative picture that urbanization is a problem for wild animals, and it really is a problem, but what is missing is that we just have to account for the fact that more and more wild animal species live with us in urban environments. They are here to stay. They are not just visiting, they are dwelling. So what's missing in the picture is interspecies communities between urban animals, and by urban animals I mean human beings that naturally live in urban environments, and new wild urban animals. Let's look at some examples, and I focus on the red foxes because I know a little bit of red foxes. The red fox is one species that is really thriving in anthropogenic habitats. And the red fox is doing quite good in urban environments. In Switzerland, for example, the fox population drastically increased after the rabies from the 1960s to the 1990s. And the same fact has been reported in other parts of Europe. So now red foxes became common in urban areas throughout Europe. So in all European cities you have huge and stable populations of red foxing, not only visiting but dwelling in the city. One interesting fact about red foxes is given by this very famous experiment by the Russian scientist Dmitry Belyaev. Belyaev started in the 1950s an experiment where he tried to domesticate foxes. And he used not red foxes, but silver foxes. He had them for a fur farm and started a long-term experiment in domestication. And his idea, his hypothesis was, when I select tame foxes against aggressive foxes, there will be hormonal and neurochemical changes in the subsequent generations, and this will produce physical changes. And within only 10 generations, so in a very short time, the selected foxes behaved a little bit like dogs. They were not afraid of humans, they liked being petted, they licked the trainer's hands and foot, they whimper and whine if they are not happy, they remain calm in tense situations, and they wag the tails when they are happy. Also, they show visible appearances of domestication. On the black and white picture, you can see Belyaev stroking a fox, but look at the tail of the fox. The point of the tail of the fox is white. So that's a change that's indicating a trend towards domestication. And the same goes for the color picture, where you can see puppies of foxes that show black and white, which is also a sign of a tendency to domestication. They also started having fluffy ears, okay, like lap dogs that you have, and this is also a sign. So foxes are able to adapt in a few generations in a quite strong manner. And this seems to happen to urban foxes. So some research on urban foxes showed that urban foxes change their morphology. They have wider and shorter muscles, so the muscle goes back. They have smaller brain cases, which indicates that they have smaller brains. There is a reduced dimorphism, so female and male foxes are not so distinct and separated as in the rural population, and there are also genetic differences. And what you also can see in urban foxes that there are behavioral adaptations. They are not always stressed out, so they are more tame. And they find other food sources and they easily adapt to other food sources. There is also indication that some birds show other patterns of perceptual attendance. So they attend to other things. This means the urban city changes animals living in the city in a quite short period on the level of phenotype and also, as it seems, on the genomic level. So urban environments are drivers in the evolution of new species. And these new species are here to stay with us. But this kind of staying with us produces now a lot of misunderstandings. And let me point to a very natural misunderstanding I very often encounter when I talk to people about urban foxes. They tell me, look, urban foxes lose their natural shyness. Well, they lose their shyness. So the escape behavior is different, and they not always run away when stressors like cars or human beings are approaching. But are we talking of natural shyness? The rural fox is naturally shy, but that's a rural fox. It's natural for the urban fox to be less shy. So there is nothing like natural shyness and artificial shyness in the city. That's a bad distinction. Urban foxes are different, and they will become more and more different, and the rural fox is not the natural thing. So we should give up the idea that the fox living in the woods is the real thing, and the fox living in the city is the unreal thing, like T.S. Eliot said, unreal cities just producing unnatural things. And there is another point. Losing shyness does not imply aggressiveness. So many people think when urban foxes lose natural shyness, or as I prefer to say, shyness, they become more aggressive. But that's not the fact. They become less shy, so they do not escape. But that's not the same like becoming more aggressive. Most cases of aggressive foxes in Swiss cities I know are due to feeding the fox. So the fox loses the shyness, you feed them, and they expect food from human beings, and if the expectation is not fulfilled, they become, in a way, demanding, and this is interpreted as being aggressive. So aggressiveness is not something that the fox has because he loses shyness, that's because of wrong interaction with the other urban animals, with human beings. So we have to learn about these animals, and we have to use language very carefully when we want to live with these animals in urban environments. There is a lot of indication that the next wave of immigration in city from the rural surroundings will be badgers. As a study by Madeleine Geiger and colleagues in Switzerland has shown, badgers are catching up. So there is the next wave of Middle European predators entering the cities. Observations in urban areas have been interpreted first as relics of formerly rural populations that have survived urban encroachment. So first one thought, well, the city is expanding, and some stupid badgers were just staying there, and they have been in a way surrounded, and now they're completely shocked because they lost their natural surroundings. But new data suggests, like the evidence I quote here from Switzerland, that badgers are following a similar trend as foxes. So they're really entering and becoming not only visitors, but dwellers of urban landscapes. And the data they collected is from traffic casualties, so from badgers killed in traffic, from camera trap studies, and from incidental observations by citizens. So it seems that badgers start the colonization of urban habitats, and it's the next thing we will have in our gardens. So we should better learn to live with them. One possibility is to fight them, so then we start a kind of urban war, or we learn about the badgers and arrange interspecies communities with them. Now let me come to the final part, and the final part will point to a few ways how we can actually organize living together with urban wild animals in urban environments, what I call human-animal communities. First, let me give you two examples on the individual level. On the individual level, I think it's very important that we think about our symbolic representations of urban animals. Here you can see an old affiche from France, where the urban population is asked to destruct rats by poisoning them. Détruisez les rats, because rats are responsible for the bubonic plague. Marseille ravagée par la peste en 1720, which means that Marseille has been destructed by the bubonic plague, and this is due to the rats. So rats are always seen as something that brings bad news because it's a transmitter of diseases. Of course, that's also the case. Diseases and parasites are a big issue here, but still we should be careful not to frame these animals always in images and languages that make a bad influence on how we perceive them. We should look for new expressions and new images of these animals. The next thing on the individual level is what I call simple curiosity, learning about animals. The example I have just been giving is foxes lose their shyness. What does that mean? So there's the natural shyness aspect and the distinction between shyness and aggressiveness. A first example here is I've been talking about incidental observation when the colleagues in Switzerland were collecting data about the badgers living in the cities. And of course, these observations were given from Swiss citizens which participated in a science project, in a citizen science project. So one thing that would be very interesting if you engage in citizen science projects collecting data about mammals and other animals living in urban environments in order to collect databases that help us learn more here. And the other example I just gave is the example of the shyness. What does this really mean when the fox loses its shyness? But there is not only the individual level, there is also a communal level or a political level. These two levels are very important and they reflect a recent change in animal ethics. In the old days, animal ethics was like an individual decision. You know, I become vegan or vegetarian, it's my individual choice or decision. Now we think in animal ethics more and more about taking a political turn, which is called a political turn in animal ethics. That individual level decisions are not enough to protect animals, to preserve animals, and to live with animals in urban environments. We also need the communal or the political level. And here are two ideas. The first is, of course, planning. Planning urban cities and urban environments is a huge issue and an important issue. And one important idea is that planning should also include planning for supportive structures for urban animals. So usually animals are not part of the plan when you build a house or when you build a garden or a park or when you develop a part of the city. But since they live there and are dwellers, one should also, by reasons of justice, take animals living there into account. A nice example, this is in the picture, is the so-called Augsburg model of pigeons. They had produced constructions where pigeons actually can fly in, where they are nursed and the eggs are taken away in order to do a little bit of population control with the pigeons. Another example is from Berlin, the squirrel rope. In Berlin, the Pushkin-Allee is a street with a lot of traffic, and when the squirrels wanted to cross the street from the park to the other side, they usually get just killed and squeezed by the traffic. And the people living there started to produce rope constructions between the trees in the park and their balconies, and so the squirrels could just move above the traffic. So that's a simple way of constructing a supportive structure that helps animals survive in an aggressive new environment. And of course, there is also the issue of political representation. This was formulated in this very nice book by Sue Donaldson and Will Kymlicka, the book that is called Zoopolis. It's also translated in German, Zoopolis, and most recently the book by the Berlin philosopher and political scientist Bernd Lavig, Politische Philosophie der Tierrechte. And they both claim that for reasons of justice and democracy, we should start political representation of animals in our democratic systems. Why? Because animals are affected by our decisions. And the basic principle of democracy is you should include all those that are affected by the decision taken by a democratic institution. And of course, animals are very much affected by our decisions. So you should have someone representing animals on the political level. This could be an animal attorney, this could be a special interest group with certain rights, or it could be a qualified veto by a certain majority or minority in a parliament that represents the interests of animals living in urban spaces. It's not only done if you do it on the individual level, you also need the communal or the political level. Let me finally conclude, and I hope I can point in the direction of Patrick Goddard here, that I think that also artistic exploration is doing a great service to understand other life forms like animals living in urban environments. Here is one example, the project Rough Love in Basel, Erzählen mit Tauben und geschätzte Tiere, telling stories with pigeons and valuing animals. And the project was basically that two artists, Seraina Dürr and Jonas Gillmann, lived together with pigeons in a kind of Wohngemeinschaft in a residential community with pigeons in the old ticket office of the Theatre of Basel. I was visiting them several times, also talking to them. We had video chats, and this was producing a lot of discussions. What the heck are they doing, living with dirty creatures in one room? So what they wanted to do is to produce a different image of living together with pigeons that have a very bad image as Ratten der Lüfte and other mean descriptions of these very kind, intelligent and nice animals. So here is the final conclusion. I will not read all the points. I made all the points. I'm very much looking forward now to the exchange with you, Patrick, and with you, the audience. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. This is really, I think, very insightful and also stimulating how we can think about these communities further. And we want to start the discussion with Patrick first, and then you in the audience, we would also like to have your ideas and contributions, so you can already start thinking about what you want to ask or contribute. And also people in the live stream, you can, those who have my WhatsApp, they can just text me and send the question or comments you have. I think we need a short Umbaupause to get Patrick on the screen, yes? Okay. So, but then we can start with the public, I think. Sure. So who wants to respond or have a question? So, I think we have to do it, yeah. I'll pause to get Patrick on the screen, yes?
Maybe it's getting too loud here with this thing. I have a question. You mentioned the zoos.
Then we start with the public, I think.
Sure.
So who wants to respond or have a question?
What?
So, this is the time delay.
No.
No, it's already
It's
there.
a bit confusing, but
The
yeah.
man in the second row.
No pause to get Patrick on the screen, yes?
Okay. Thank you for the answer. I didn't have an opportunity to ask the question, but anyway.
So it's a technical problem. Just you have to
Hello,
solve
can you hear me?
Patrick has to close his YouTube.
Hello.
Patrick, can you hear us?
I can hear you. Yeah. Hi. Can you see me?
Could you just stop your YouTube because we hear you YouTube.
Oh crap. Yeah. I've stopped it. Sorry.
And,
yeah.
because
Hi.
we had a delay, we have first a question from the audience, and then we come to you.
Okay.
Just 1 second.
Okay. Can you hear me? The question, you mentioned zoos and of course we know the Zolli in Basel as well, as places of recreation. But for that purpose, why do you need exotic animals? Wouldn't it do to have, like in Central Europe, Central European animals, the only thing you have to provide is that you can see the animals, because most wild animals are difficult to see, especially on daylight. But why do you need elephants, giraffes, rhinoceroses, and so on for recreation? I don't understand. That's just for curiosity, but not for recreation, in my mind.
Okay, thank you very much for the question. So I was really focusing on this aspect of recreation, and let's focus there. And of course, I, for one, do not really believe that we need zoos for this recreational aspect. And your question makes it very clear that there is an issue here. Why do we have this kind of wild and exotic animals in our zoos, mostly from the African continent? Well, it was in its beginnings, the zoo was a colonial project. So we wanted to represent the colonies in Europe. And of course, there were also scientific interests, but recreation was not the first thing. It's to learn about the nature and the part of nature where European communities are the rulers. And that's why exotic animals were much more interesting and much more important. But then when the idea came that colonialism is not the real issue here, but recreation, another aspect became important. Many people said, look, a lot of people will not be able to travel, let's say, to Central Africa or to South America or to Australia. So they should be able to see exotic animals and exotic wildlife in their surroundings, in their cities. And that was the other reason that was given for exotic animals. But the fact is, they are just there because we started zoos as a project of colonialism.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so Patrick, I think before we have Angelika, Patrick, because this is also your topic. Hi, Patrick. Great to see you. You can't see us. Sorry, but the question. I can't see
you. I'm just looking at myself. It's great.
The question that was just raised about this zoo, the zoo is a really important issue also in your animal antics. So probably we bring you in there and to comment on what Markus had said, or just start from here, and then we have another question from the public.
I don't know if I have a position particularly on zoos. I think I started making the film being a little bit anti-zoo. And I ended up being a bit more sympathetic to zoos, although I don't, just because many of the animals or some of the more exotic animals there simply don't necessarily have homes elsewhere. There's an argument that says, they've ceased to be captives and they're now asylums, the zoo as an asylum. Which is like the most tragic thing in the world I can imagine, as the zoo being the safest place for the animal. That is a real sort of terrible thing, terrible state of the world. But I wonder if that's, and of course that doesn't apply to wild animals in the city or foxes, pigeons, blah blah blah. But what's and this is sort of going off topic a little bit from the zoo, but I had some questions for Markus. I hope I could ask them. Markus, I like your bat T-shirt, by the way.
Just Patrick, wait a second. Angelika, do you have a question or to the zoo?
Yes, a little bit.
So I think we stay with the zoo and then we go. Patrick, we stay with the zoo and then we come to you, okay. So please.
Hi, just to follow up a little bit on the zoo topic. Sorry, I just to have a sidetrack, because during what the gentleman has asked and your response, and I also think about, I'm originally from Hong Kong, and I think the domesticated animals like dogs, specific species like huskies, Saint Bernard, Samoyed, they were imported to a really humid and hot places. I mean, something like that, makes me really alert on the welfare and the benefits of these, well-beings of these animals. But of course, going back, what do the two of you think of the future? I mean, in your opinions, what is the future of zoo in the world? And also, I mean, will it be likely to disappear in our urban spaces in the near future? What are your thoughts? I'm just curious. Thank you.
Markus, do you want to take that up, or shall I jump into it?
I can say 2 points, and maybe you add. Okay.
Yeah.
So, I think zoos are now really in a transformation. So you can see this, and I just talk about Switzerland because that's a place I know. The new director of the zoo in Zurich tries really to transform the zoo in the kind of place where education is not about the animals, but about connections with loss of biodiversity and with loss of habitat. So they try to reduce the amount of animals and try to establish concrete relations with the natural habitat for reintroducing animals in the wild. And I think that's one perspective on the future of the zoo. The zoo should really not be, a breeding machine for zoos, but something where you really can add to biodiversity and also educate the people about these connections. And one thing that personally interested me most, that the new director in Zurich also changed the diet you can have in the zoo. So there is not only meat, you can have other things. And that's, of course, part of going in a better direction when it comes to loss of biodiversity. I think it's completely perverse to go in the zoo and eating meat at the same time and then think, oh, I help saving the animals by eating a lot of stupid meat. No, that's not working. So I think zoos are going in a direction, and I had the same experience maybe as Patrick when really talking to the people and not just wailing at their walls. I learned a little bit a different perspective.
Okay, Patrick.
Yeah, I think I'm going to be really sort of in navel gazing here and quote from my own film, because I think I'm going to quote the little dog. I don't know if anyone's seen the film that's in the basement beneath you now, but the dog who's sort of a bit of a bigot, I guess. The appeal to her is that she says, "I'm going to do it in the dog's voice." Experiencing something a bit real, a bit raw, a primordial encounter, but a safe one. I mean, these guys, they're actually alive and scary, very retro. They're a real bit of living history, not like the cartoons on the telly. They're here like a freak show from the past, kept alive in the mausoleum. So I think that, for me, that is the appeal or the entertainment factor, or the thrill of seeing exotic animals in the zoo, that they seem something from a different world, that they seem something totally other, and could be quite scary. And just like seeing a horror film, we enjoy this sort of this experience of potentially fear or other sort of visceral bodily reactions, but also from a very safe place, from the comfort of our own home or from the cinema. And so the wild, or the existential experience of the wild, can be safely consumed as spectacle, and with tamed to be. I think the crucial word is safe. So we want to feel kind of thrilled by this sort of pure otherness, this exotic sort of these alien species, but it's sort of from the comfort of our own trainers and snacks in our pockets and behind this safe enclosure. So I think zoos say for me, zoos are interesting places because they say a lot about humans, perhaps more than they say about the animals that they house. I was about to say they home, but maybe they imprison. I don't know. It depends how you see it. I don't know if that answered your question of the role of zoos or the importance of zoos. I think there's a zillion different types of zoos in the world. There's some great zoos which are more like safari parks, and there are some kind of like crazy ex-Soviet zoos with some very depressed polar bears wandering around concrete enclosures, and there's a huge scale from one to the other.
Okay, does anyone want to comment? So, does anyone know, are there new zoos built, or is it really a mausoleum of the past? Just, I mean, it's a heritage we have somehow to care and get rid of. That's how I see it, or to transform it into something else.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I, for one, I'm very skeptical of zoos in general, because they, in a way, they pretend to educate a lot, to do a lot of research, but the point is always, otherwise, I think one could do it better. One can learn a lot about animals from other sources. So I think education is possible without enclosing animals in zoos or homing them in zoos. And also research can be done otherwise. So I'm rather skeptical. And I'm more a fan of a very reductionist or minimal idea of a zoo. The thing they try in Barcelona, where they have decided that you should only have those species in zoos that you can put back in the wilderness. So all the other species should not be bred in zoos, because then it's only breeding for the sake of the zoos. And I think the people start a little bit to change their mind about the zoos. Just to give you an impression by an anecdote, it was 2019, the population of Basel voted about an expansion of the zoo, an oceanium, so a huge aquarium, and it was already financed, and there was a counter-initiative against this idea of having more animals in an urban environment, and to the big surprise of everyone, the Basel population was against building an aquarium in Basel, because they thought we don't need more animals in the city in order to understand that they do not have a good fate now by the pollution of the seas. And in contrast to that, the people of Basel, or a part of the people, started to solidarize with the deer in the cemetery of the Hörnli, because they wanted to shoot the deer in the cemetery, and people were shocked. Cannot go in the cemetery and start shooting animals, and they started to solidarize with the animals really living in urban environments. And I think this is just an anecdote, but I think it shows a change in perspective. We live with wild animals. We don't have to import them in artificial surroundings like an aquarium.
Do I have the wrong microphone? Hopefully not. We have another comment from the public.
Thanks very much for the very interesting lecture. There is one name that I was expecting to hear, but I did not. So I wanted to ask you what your thinking is about Donna Haraway's thinking. Thank you.
Okay, I was a little bit alluding to...
Yeah, you quoted her already.
Yeah, I of course was alluding to her with the interspecies society and the interspecies connection. And of course, her idea that we should think of human beings not just being isolated persons, where on the other side in nature there are animals, is a very important idea for rethinking our relationship with animals. So she thinks we should realize that we already are in relation with a lot of animals in our bodies, in our surroundings, and we do not have to establish these relations, but just focus on these relations. And that's the kind of relational turn she takes. And in a way, my take on urban animals was a weak form of a Haraway take. because I thought we already live with wild animals in urban environments, so we should realize that fact and start understanding us as inhabiting the same environment like the foxes. The foxes are not out there. They're inside our cities and they live with us. They start adapting to us and they do it quite successfully. We should start doing the same.
Patrick, was Donna Haraway also inspiration for your animal antics? Because, I mean, you somehow, ironically, Sarah is so kind. She, I think for me, she's the figure who is in this interspecies relation already with her dog, with the giraffe. Yeah.
I mean, kind of, you know, Donna Haraway talks about companion species and obviously about, I think, her dog quite a lot. The film, for those who haven't seen it, downstairs at eWork, has a small talking dog.
Patrick, your connection is unstable.
Around with its presumed owner. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello?
Yeah. Yes, now we can hear you.
Okay. Oh, sorry. So I'm just going to repeat what I said. So I am interested in Donna Haraway's idea of companion species, and specifically dogs. In the film Animal Antics, the camera follows the main protagonist Sarah and her presumably pet dog called Whoopsie. Whoopsie is a Bichon Frise, which is a pedigree type of lap dog. Now, lap dogs are, in English at least, I don't know what the German word would be for a lap dog, is any type of dog that has been specifically bred as a companion species, usually to sit on your lap. So many species were bred to kind of sit on the laps of wealthy people to keep their laps warm as kind of living hot water bottles. So I am super interested, and I don't know if I have an exact position on the idea of the lap dog or of the companion species, but there is always a hierarchical politics between us and companion species or other animals, or, in this sort of community of animals. Now we can be aware of them and we can appreciate them, as Haraway suggests, but I don't know if under the current state of capitalism, whether we can truly have them as equals, because the wild animals sort of sit outside, by their definition, sit outside of capitalism, and I don't know if capital really recognizes anything that isn't productive for it as either a producer or a consumer. This actually sort of leads me a little bit onto a question I had for Markus, actually. Can I do that?
Yes, please.
So, of course, I acknowledge that there have always been wild animals in cities, but I was wondering if you could hazard a definition, or at least a description of the wild, maybe with a capital W, as a place, either as a political place or as a geographical place.
Okay, I think it's hard to give it a definition because, like nature, there are several concepts in place here. So one concept of the wild I was using is just as a contrast to an urban space, to urban landscapes. So everything that is outside the urban landscapes is in this sense the wild, that there are non-domesticated animals. So the idea was always that in the city there live human beings and only domesticated animals, and the non-domesticated are outside. That's one notion of the wild, where the city is the border or the frontier. Another one is the place where animals live beyond human creation, you know, the wild in the sense not only beyond the city, but also beyond rural landscape that are transformed by agriculture. Then you would go to glaciers or mountains or in the deep sea. But now I think the last frontier is, in a way, taken by the idea of an Anthropocene, that there is no space outside what we have been created. And now my idea is that the wild, of course, does not disappear by the fact that we influence most of urban space, but the wild pops again up in the heart of its contrary, in the cities. So the cities were thought to be the exact opposite of the wild. And what fascinates me about the growth of mammals and birds entering the cities is that in the least expected space, they start new kinds of evolution. And so that was my idea, that the wild is really reappearing on another level in urban landscapes. So it's more a shifting notion than a clear notion or a clear space.
Patrick?
Yeah, I suppose I see the wild as a sort of a non-commodified, an uncontrolled, an unmoderated, an uncultivated space, which can of course be the cracks in between the paving slabs, and can of course be the bit behind the gutter, and can of course be all of these sort of fissures and cracks within the city. But there's also a tendency in especially Western cities of a cleanliness drive, this idea that clean is good, that controlled is good, that everything is moderated, and if there are animals, then they are tolerated, if not culled or controlled. And I suppose I wonder, my personal interest in previous research has perhaps been more interested in the wild and the wild city, both for animals, but also what the wild city might mean for humans, slightly more existentially, I suppose. And wondering if comparisons can be taken from leaving room for the wild within the city, and what that might be as a metaphor for the wild places that humans can also, the human animal can also kind of inhabit, and what that might look like. Yeah. So I suppose I'm coming from a slightly more psychogeographic place of thinking about the city, a slightly romantic idea of the city as an informative, ludic, having a ludic function, and as the street as a place of disorder and surprises and dirt and clutter and chaos, and wondering, and slightly more political and anarchic position, I personally would rather celebrate the anarchic tendencies of that cities can have, and of course, and I'm worried, I suppose, as certainly London gets increasingly cleansed.
I think just to say a word, maybe that's another notion.
Wild party for wild. Sorry, Marcus, go on.
Oh, okay. I think I was just thinking about the notion you're introducing is the kind of uncontrolled space of cracks, of non-cleanliness, of surprises. In a way, it stands in contrast, as I understand you, to control, to capitalization, to organized structures. In any case, enlivens the surrounding. And I mean, I could think, because my focus is always animals, I could think of animals being this kind of, non-cleanly surprising spaces within city. That's one reason I'm interested in them. But my main point was a little bit, if animals are something wild in the city, they're not something that really contrasts with the clean parts of the city. So animals have to interact with everything they encounter in city, be it the parts you call more the anarchic, wild parts, or be it more the cleanly organized part. This was this relational idea. So there is no contrast between the animal and the city. It's just a new environment where the animal has, in a way, to adapt and change his life habits, and we change and adapt with them. And that was my idea, and might create a new, rewilding, because the animals are able to surprise you and give you perspectives that are different than the perspective you have as a human being. So that was my idea of rewilding by recognizing animals in the city. But this was a completely different focus, I guess, from your focus on the cracks in the city.
But I think there is a common idea, because you also introduced this political notion that animals should be represented, and I think this leads us to urban planning. So why can't we have these animal rights or these wild zones integrated and not just taken over by all these real estate money machines? So I think this is really the big question. Where do we allow and plan to have these interspecies and these relations happening? We have another question from, or a comment from the public. Thank you, Patrick. It was very nice, your comment on the wild.
Yeah, when I hear you talking, I always have to come back to think about colonialism, I have to say. And before, Patrick, you said that you can learn a lot about humans when looking at zoos. And I think you can learn a lot about white humans, I guess. And I'm not sure if you're talking about humans, I always think like you're talking about white humans. And I haven't seen your show yet, but I will after this talk. Maybe this is also a topic you're into or you work around. But right now I had the impression that maybe this isn't too important for the two of you, or like that you think you can split like the whole colonial part of this topic from the topic, basically. How do you think about it? And do you think like developing zoos is basically, or like, I guess now, I think developing zoos is basically also a decolonizing practice. What do you think about this? Thanks.
Thank you. We have similar questions from the chat. Thank you.
And Patrick, because you don't see us, I think by now I'm like, oh no, maybe not. But there aren't too many non-white people in here, so just...
we have some in the chat.
Very good.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of can't comment. I suppose I was talking about people who go to zoos, and I don't know the average ethnic makeup of zoo goers. I suppose I was also, I guess, biased towards people who live most of their lives in cities, and I guess Western cities, divorced from a notion of the wild that might in any way be threatening, or might in any way interact with your life, a mere curiosity.
Patrick, it's difficult to understand you.
I'm not qualified to comment whether that's... Oh, sorry. Is it the reception? Do you want me to talk slower?
No, it's the connection. So I think
it works better
when you stay away.
The image, when he talks,
yeah.
she should shut down the image,
yeah,
because
yeah.
there's too much data.
Probably you could, that we just get a black screen. Yeah. But yeah, I have a similar question from the audience, and so Jasmine is asking. Well, I mean, there is a lot discussion going on of of giving back artifacts stolen from Africa. Is there also a debate of giving back stolen animals? as a kind of decolonizing strategy?
There is a colonial discourse, of course, about zoos. I pointed to one, what I called the colonial origins, so that it's kind of an instrument that represents the rule of, say, Europe over other parts of the world. There is also a debate whether, that zoos cooperate with habits for animals in parts, say, of Asia or Africa, whether this is just a kind of a new colonialism. So that, in a way, we want to protected areas in large part of Central Africa, and these protected areas should be kept free in order for wildlife to thrive. And from a perspective of many environmentalists, as I have heard from Kenya and other countries, this is perceived as being very problematic, and they see those protected areas in a way as kind of new colonies. And I think that's a very important perspective, because if we talk of the Anthropocene, we always talk as if all humans had affected the world in the same manner, but actually that's not true. I think the Anthropocene is covering an important difference. Industrialization and pollution in Europe or North America has a long, deep history. So the contribution to the changes by Anthropocene are very strong by people living in the southern hemisphere. So I was a little bit worried of touching on those topics in my talk because it would lead me too far, because urbanization is a very hot topic in many African countries, and also the contrast producing protected areas for biodiversity. That's why I was focusing on, let's say, European cities. The most examples I used are animals introduced or living in European cities. But I think that the problematic of colonies, given the colonial past of the zoos and also the criticism of protected areas, is certainly a topic worth addressing. But I don't think I was up to this task in my talk, given what is my background, my scientific background.
So in a way you think you can divide those two as well, or you don't have to always think those two together, in your opinion?
No, I think one should put those two perspectives together. But I don't think that it's always good to put those perspectives together when, for example, addressing animals in urban surroundings. I hinted at the colonial past, and I hinted at the different rates of urbanization in different parts of the world. And this, of course, is a question of the relation between different parts of the world, not only between white people and other people. And I was not thinking that one should separate this, but for the sake of the focus I wanted to make, I was interested in re-entering wild animals in urban landscape in European cities, and that's why I chose the examples as I did.
So I think this is really an interesting topic we should take up for another talk.
I'd love to, yes.
Thank you so much
I'm
for
coming as a guest.
Exactly, we will invite someone. Yes, there is another question. I will come. And so thank you very much for this lively debate. I really enjoyed.
It's like a kind of like a small follow-up to your question, because I found it actually very interesting when you mentioned, of course, zoos have this colonial heritage. But if you think about human-animal relationships, don't you think there are like it's sometimes I cannot really argue for it, but there is a similarity to relationships between humans, which are formed by racism. Like that racism, like if you think about relationships between humans, which are racist, and if you think about human-animal relations, isn't there like a structural similarity, or wouldn't it help to take this into account?
Yeah, I mean that's an important issue, but this issue has been explored a little bit from another perspective, and there is, of course, this kind of relation. So recently, a lot of people from animal ethics and from animal sociology have started asking the question, why are we so slow of making changes in our relation to animals? So we know that a lot of things we do, our living habits, are extremely harmful to animals, to domesticated animals, to wild animals. And we also know that the way we treat them is harmful for us. So a lot of things that come up with the climate crisis, like climate change, loss of biodiversity, etc., have something to do with our relation to animals. And also the pandemic we are in has something to do with our relation to animals. So there are a lot of extremely good reasons to think very hard about our relationship, and not only to think very hard, but also change it. But we are super slow in doing so. And one explanation is, of course, our relation to animals is structured by capitalist interests, so it's an enormous important business. But there is also another issue here, that animals are really kind of the others. There is a kind of tribalism. That's the term researchers use when they go into this kind of topic. And the tribalism that just distinguishes between insiders and outsiders. And we think of human beings as more as our insiders and as animals as complete outsiders. And of course, when we go back into the relation of humans between human groups, tribalism is very, very strong. So there is racist tribalism, there's sociological tribalism, there's gender tribalism, and so on. And tribalism is just a strong structure that excludes a certain amount of other persons or of other living beings because we do not see that they belong to us. And in this very general sense, I think there is, of course, a relation to issues of racism and other kinds of strong exclusion and producing of group homogeneity. And this also structures our relation to animals, I think, yes. But I think that's more a topic I would address when it comes to the relation to animals in general. So my topic was really thriving animals in urban landscapes. And that's like a tiny bit of animals. When you think about the percentage of mammals that lives now on Earth, more mammals that live on Earth are domesticated cattle, birds, we eat pigs. So more domesticated mammals live on Earth than wild animals. So that's a completely different topic, how this tribalism produces extreme harm to environment, animals, and ourselves. And there are relations, yeah.
In response a little bit to the previous two questions, can you hear me now, by the way?
Yes, perfect. Thank you. Yes, Patrick.
Oh,
go on.
Hi. Yeah, thanks for asking those two vital questions. I hope you'll get a chance to view the film downstairs. Perhaps some of you have already. But for me, the film that I made, Animal Ethics, is the film's an allegory that looks at how we might an allegory, if not racism, but for xenophobia, and looking at how we might value animals as sort of a metaphor or an example of how we might view others or other people that we other humans that we are different to, or perhaps don't understand or can't understand, and or we might view as being different. The irony of the film is that it's all being delivered from the perspective of a dog who seems to think that it is not one of the animals that it's referring to. So very much what the last question was referring to was for me very much the thrust of the work, and I think there's a great sort of parallel between animal studies or how we might view or value that which is not us, and whilst accepting, or I don't know, there's yeah, I don't know. That didn't really answer it at all, but I think there's an obvious parallel for me between and lessons that can be brought over from post-colonial politics and racial studies to the sphere of animals and animal philosophies and back again, and that is how we should value that which we view as different.
I think this is a nice final statement, and if you agree, or are there more questions?
Can I ask maybe a silly question to Patrick? Patrick, I admired your film about the animal ethics very much, and I was really surprised by the effect that, you know, the dog is so bigot and lecturing and a little bit not how I would imagine a dog should be. And now the silly question is just this, because I'm not good in English accents. Is there an association with something with the accent of the dog? So the way the dog speaks, would this resonate with something if I would be a native English speaker, or is it just the kind of voice you make? So is it a specific social perspective that transpires in this dialect, or isn't it?
It is probably a slightly posher voice than the main protagonist, Sarah. Sarah has a voice from the Midlands, so England's a funny place when it comes to class and accents.
Yeah.
Unlike many other countries, accents really do traditionally dictate what class you're viewed as being part of, which is kind of nuts. So Sarah has a Midlands accent from Nottingham, which is an industrial part of, traditionally industrial part, and the dog has a slightly more southern accent, which is London, a bit more of a London accent, but is also sort of has pompous inclinations or pompous intonations to the voice. Whilst not being overtly posh, it is a little bit more upper class than Sarah's voice.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I think this is definitely the time we should go and watch the film again downstairs. So thank you so much for coming. Also the live stream, for the lively discussion. And I think we will continue, and looking forward to welcoming you all soon in another discussion. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.
Bye, Patrick.
And Patrick, of course, thank you for being with us.
Thanks a lot, guys. Okay, bye-bye. Great to meet you, Markus. I hope I'll meet you one day in real life. Love the bat t-shirt. Bye. See ya.